Okay, so quick revision video here. It's about selfishness or greed in Inspector Calls. And we're going to think about some key characters that show it. There's an exam question for you. How does Priestley present ideas about selfishness and their effects in Inspector Calls? So if that's your question on your exam, the first thing we're going to think about is who is selfish and why are they selfish? What do they represent? So those characters represent something, okay? For me, Sheila is selfish at the beginning because there's a sense of being materialistic, and she represents the privileged classes who were sheltered from real life. She congratulates herself. She's unwilling to see a different viewpoint, and she's jealous. Gerald and Eric are selfish because they are both examples of men that use Eva Smith for their own gratification and desire, and then they discard her. They represent patriarchy and patriarchal selfishness that Priestley wanted to call out. These men get the gratification, they discard the working class woman, and Priestley says, look at society, it allows it. Okay, now Eric does show remorse for this, but we can't really justify his actions. Gerald never really thinks he's done anything wrong. And obviously, when we think about selfishness, we think about the older generation, and they're represented through Mrs. Berlin. In my response, Mrs. Berlin is selfish, and she shows very little humanity in the way that she treats Eva, who's in need. She shows no empathy. And to Berling, Eva's death's a joke. Priestley has a message here that some people can't change, and they're the villains. So Sheila, there's a few key quotations here. One of the first ones is when she takes out the ring at the beginning and she says, oh, it's wonderful, look, mummy, isn't it a beauty? That ring, I think, is an absolutely essential symbol in this play. When she takes the ring, it's a representation of it looks good, it's material value, so that makes her successful. We know at the end of the play, she gives that ring back to Gerald, and that is a really symbolic idea of she won't return to the life that she once had. When she gives that ring back, life is no longer what it was, and that's when we see her selfishness end. In Act 1, when she gets the ring, she says, now I really feel engaged. It makes it sound like a child, okay? And sheltered. She thinks that being married is about having a big ring or having expensive things. And there's a suggestion that she wasn't truly engaged until she had an expensive piece of jewellery on her finger. Priestley wants us to see that she might have had all this education, she might have all this money, but really she's just a child. She talks about when she had met Eva Smith at Millwoods, and she said she was very pretty too, with big dark eyes, and that didn't make it any better. Now, the word pretty in an Inspector Calls is really important because Priestley repeats that Eva Smith was pretty all the way through, and he's doing it to show that the poor weren't ugly, they weren't monsters, the poor could be beautiful. To Sheila, though, having everything isn't enough. She finds offence that Eva Smith, who's poor, could be more beautiful than her. And this shows her sheltered and selfish ways. Okay? She refuses to be happy or grateful for somebody else's beauty. She just wants to mean it. So we've said Gerald and Eric are selfish because they use Eva Smith for their own gratification and they discard her. Okay? This is Gerald. He says, I suppose it was inevitable. She was young and pretty and warm-hearted and intensely grateful. I became at once the most important person in her life. The way that he talks about it is as if she's an object, okay? He repeats young, pretty, warm-hearted, basically what he can see, almost, okay? Young and pretty, the way that he says it, it makes him sound a little bit sinister as well. Priestley wants us to see this man who talks about this woman in a really kind of sinister way. He says, I became the most important person in her life, and Gerald is somebody who thinks nobody's better than himself. Okay, remember, Gerald is of a higher status than the Burlings, and yeah, Priestley presents society that he is so deluded that he thinks because she's poor and he's rich, that all of a sudden he clicks his fingers and he becomes the most important person, that nothing else that's happened in her life before is of importance. That is ultimately selfishness, the refusal to see somebody else as a human being. He tries to justify his actions with this really important quotation nearly any man would have done. We understand that Gerald's done wrong. He's been unfaithful. Okay, he's used Daisy Renton, as he knows her, for his own gratification. But he tries to just justify his actions with nearly any man would have done the same. He talks about how he's got no self-control, self-restraint. And Priestley wants to see that money doesn't buy you morality. It doesn't buy you goodness. It doesn't buy you a respectful nature. Okay? You might have a lot of money, but he's not like somebody like Eva Smith who has morals. Okay, he's got none of that. Eric, the inspector, goes in on Eric and he says that he treated her like an animal, a thing, not a person. Now, that's a really important quotation at the end, okay? And I want you to think about the phonetics of it and the syntax of it. It goes 1, 2, 3. So it's spat out almost by the inspector. That list of 3, okay, that list emphasises the devastating behaviour of Eric. He knows no bounds. I want you to look at this. We can imagine an animal. A thing is something nondescript, not a person, could be anything. As the list goes on, the inspector tells Eric that Eva was even more invisible to him. Okay, to treat her like an animal is one thing, but by the end she's not a person. Basically, Eric is so selfish that he has just taken away any humanity that this woman had. Okay, and then he's just discarded her. So even though he's sorry, we get this idea that, you know, he is kind of an ultimate villain. And then the older generation, okay, are really selfish. And I'm looking at Mrs. Berlin here. Okay, that key quotation that we got, girls of that class. We know that Eva Smith is an adult, but Mrs. Berling does what we call infantilises her, okay? She makes her into a child because she's got no respect for her. There's also the word that's dehumanised, and that links to the idea of Mrs. Berling being a rather cold woman. Now, if you're talking about Mrs. Berling in your exam and how she treats Eva Smith, I want you to get into this idea that there's no female unity in this play. Mrs. Berling doesn't even stick up for her own daughter. She tells her own daughter, Sheila, at the beginning that she's got to accept that Gerald's going to be unfaithful because he's a man. And what we see here when she refuses to help a fellow woman, we see that society is so selfish there isn't even a gender unity within them. Mrs. Berling says she was giving herself ridiculous airs. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were absurd for a girl in her position. Mrs. Berling, representative of the upper middle classes at the time, says it's absurd that Eva Smith should have morals. Okay, she mocks her, she laughs at her, she thinks it's ridiculous that she has that. We see how selfish this older generation are, okay? They can't see anything from anybody's point of view. There's no empathy. And even a mother like Mrs. Berling has no empathy. And if Mrs. Berling, as a woman, doesn't look out for Eva, then what chance does she have in society? That's what Priestley's saying to us. So, you know, if you're writing up this idea about selfishness, you want to think about how you're doing it. So, you know, when you look at your paragraphs, are you zooming on words? Are you moving outside of the text? Are you thinking about the message? Or are you thinking about Priestley? Okay, so key things there. Selfishness comes from the fact that it's a morality play. The older generation are selfish, the younger generation are sheltered and selfish, and men are selfish because they do what they want to without any consequence. So 3 different types of selfishness there, and in further videos you'll also look at this as a key theme.